live. Welcome, 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 everyone. I can see that the chat is already super active. It's so great to have you here. Thank you for joining us. Carol, Susan, Julie, April, Sandra, Christine, Laura, Marie, Paul, Jane, Vale. Awesome to see you all here tonight. And I'm so excited because, as you know, and I've been talking about this now for weeks and mailing out about it, our special guest to the community tonight is Julia Bondi, and she is an amazing woman, incredible person, and unbelievably gifted astrologer. And I'm going to let her tell you about herself because she does it much more eloquently than I could ever do it. But I'm going to say that we will have time for questions this evening. Julia has graciously going to be opening it up at the end of her talk for questions. So please, please, please hold your questions. I'm going to be monitoring the chat here this evening, and we'll let you know, okay, it's time for questions. So that's when you can put them in the chat, and that's when I will read them, hopefully in the order that it won't be too many questions at once, but I will ask Julia your questions in order because she's not watching the chat. So if you put your question in before the Q&A period, I probably won't see it. I'll probably just bypass it because the chat just keeps populating. So do hold on to those. And I would encourage you all to get pen and paper because a question might come up in the middle of Julia's talk, and then she might answer it later on in her talk, but then she might not. So that way you won't forget what you wanted to ask her when it comes time for the Q&A. So here we go. Julia, welcome to our beloved publications community. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Well, it is my honor to be here and a great blessing because I care deeply about all of us, humanity, our planet, our universe, and our role in it. And anytime I have an opportunity to speak to that, I am really just delighted.
Welcome to our beloved publications community.
Okay. Should I keep talking?
Yes, I'm so sorry.
Okay. Okay. Yes, I was saying that it really is an honor to talk to this community that is so focused on the deep work that you're doing, Danielle, and have been doing for such a long, long time. That's a great benefit to all of us. And of course, we have the opportunity to be so much of a benefit to one another and to our larger community, which is our solar system and our Milky Way galaxy and our universe. And I am an astrologer. This is not something I intended to do when I was young. I was quite focused on two things. One was a degree in psychology, which I did get in clinical psychology, and I do have a background in that, have worked in that field for a long, long time. The other interest that I had that I was passionate about is I was the girl who was up on Saturday mornings at 6 o'clock in the morning in Southern Maryland, where I lived at the time, to get on the bus and go to Washington and sit in the Senate balcony and listen to the senators when they used to have Saturday morning sessions. I was absolutely passionate about American history and deeply felt the ideal of this country, which I continue to feel to this day, and the role that it has played. Each nation, of course, has its own role, and they all have their own exceptional purpose. But being born here and being very devoted to the ideal of consciousness and liberty and freedom, which have a little different definition if you go back to the founders than the ones currently used. But we'll speak about that in just a little bit. And watching the Senate in action was very, very exciting. In fact, I worked in political activism in the 60s into the early 70s. At which point, after everything that those of us who were idealists in the time period really learned through the assassinations and ultimately the election of Richard Nixon that our work was different than we thought it was. And I can remember myself reading and being profoundly touched by the idea that if I was protesting and angry and thought I was right and everybody else was wrong, that I was contributing to the problem and not to the solution. And I had to face the reality that I definitely thought that. And I turned my attention at that point to a spiritual life and to a spiritual passion, which has remained. And it actually not only enhanced and expanded my experience of that ideal, but grounded it in consciousness and particularly in the heart, so that it was a loving response, an embracing response, as opposed to a binary and oppositional response. Because I think you are all quite familiar with the idea that one of the evolutionary moments we're living in is the evolution from the idea that there is a right and wrong, good and bad, an oppositional binary nature. There's a unity nature in which we can all meet, which is a higher dimension. And I came to know that and to trust that and to find that it is the ultimate treatment for despair, disappointment, is to know that there is a larger purpose than our left brain. And I think in those days, before I entered into a spiritual life, I was rather convinced that it was the left brain that was the solution to all things. And that does eventually lead to a lot of disappointment and a lot of despair. So the joy of coming into the spiritual awareness, into the spiritual consciousness, was actually completely healing and life affirming. And rather than in any way tarnishing my ideals, it enhanced them, and they were then supported deeply by faith, as they have been and continue to be. We are living in times, of course, in which for many people, that's very, very hard to accept, that there is a great purpose to what is unfolding, despite the suffering and the pain, which is quite real, and certainly has been throughout human history as up to this point in time, something we can evolve out of, and something we are, in fact, evolving toward that greater unity. So the talk that I had given in the summer at the eclipse that Danielle was part of was about the current political situation. And politics here is meant not to be about anything partisan, but about understanding why the politics of the country, the discussions, the arguments, the battles are what they are. And there's so many factors that we can discuss. And I want to just touch a little bit into many of them. And I look forward later to questions. The astrology community has been looking toward 2020 as a hinge in history. That's actually my term, having majored in history, a hinge in history, meaning we're turning the page, and a very, very large page it is. The past is over. We're not going back to an old normal. We're going on to create a new normal, of course, but it is going to be different. We are changed by this year, and we are changed by the events of this year. And we knew that was going to unfold this year. The reason that we knew that is because the planets Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto were meeting in the sky. And they don't meet very often in the sky. And since there are 12 signs, they don't meet in the same sign very often at all. In fact, the last time they met in Capricorn was in 1518. And the cycle moving from 1518 to now, if you give it a little bit of time on either end, because these are incremental changes that are opening up in the evolution of humanity and of the world and the larger universe, would be that we began at that time the global world that we're currently living in. If you go back to 1492, we all know the story of that the world opened up. The world is not flat, although there are evidently some people who still believe that, which is interesting. But we learned that it's not flat. And we also learned that we're part of this larger world. So what now is a global consciousness, since we're all connected, as we are tonight on the internet, and we can talk to people all over the world. We know so much more about one another, and we can travel and see each other in, not this year, but most of the time, in record time compared to what would have been even deemed possible in recent years, and particularly going back to that period of time. The idea that we'd be able to fly from one place to another in a matter of hours or even a day would have been unthinkable. So it's not that people then understood the depth and the meaning of the change of discovering that the world was not flat, that the world continued, and all these other countries that are part of our human experience were going to become more visible and more part of a larger community of peoples and of nations. Indeed, this was also a change in cosmology. And, you know, we don't particularly think about the idea of the change that ensued from learning that the earth was not flat. And at the same time, we were essentially learning, again, near that period of time, that rather than the sun revolving around the earth, that actually the earth revolves around the sun. And taking us from the center of the universe, everything revolves around us, to recognizing that we were part of a larger context, part of a solar system, part of the galaxy. I mean, eventually the science would actually give us much more information about that, and there's much, much more to come. Much of it, I think now, those of us who are meditators and who are, you know, attuned to these larger spiritual movements can feel that and know that in a deeper inner manner and receive the kind of guidance that your community is also attuned to. But that change in cosmology was quite profound in human consciousness. And if we add to that the communication revolution, even if people didn't necessarily read at that point in time, most people were illiterate, but the advent of the printing press and its subsequent development and the ability for us to have the kind of information at our fingertips that we have now, unthinkable 500 years ago, certainly, but we are, as we talk about it, living in the information age. But later I'll tell you, we're not really yet living in the information age. That is still ahead of us, and it's going to be much more exciting than what we're doing now. This is the foundation for it, but not the completion of it, or even potentially the best use of it, but it is an important use of it. So we look at communication at that time, if we look at the global world beginning to open up, and we look at change in cosmology. And then if you add to that, Martin Luther posting on the church door in Wittenberg, the 95 Theses. Now this only applied to Europe, but the Western world was going to become the leaders, also the colonizers of the world. So it was very important for the earth itself, for humanity itself, that this was occurring. And it led to the decentralization of the Catholic Church as the essential government and authority in Western Europe and in the British Isles. And as that changed, you had the rise of nation states. What was going to replace the authority of the Pope was the authority of the king. The kings, of course, had authority prior to that, but not the kind of authority that presidents and prime ministers have as leaders of nations in which the people have a voice. And that was quite new in human history. Yes, we can go back to Greece, and we had a brief period of that. But essentially, the rise of nation states was very different than the feudal period. And it was very different than anybody expected that it would be. The ability to conceive of how this would affect us, of course, was not possible then, any more than we can project forward exactly to the next 500-year cycle and see what the structures will be of that time, the institutions of that time. And we're at the end of that cycle. The fact that these three planets, again, are meeting in Capricorn is telling us that the institutions and the structures and the belief systems, the dogmas, this is the only truth, or this is the limit of knowledge, or the limit of possibility, that is coming to an end. And what we're looking at now is the Jupiter period with Jupiter in Capricorn is telling us that we can build better institutions. We can do more. We can make them not only more resilient, but more humane, more conscious, more beneficial to all of us. So we need to be able to envision, how could we make things better? What is the purpose of an institution or of a belief system or of an organization, how we organize our societies, and how can we make this better? And we can look back throughout hundreds of years, certainly, but also in recent years, and many of the ways that people are, in fact, trying to create something better. And whether it's better in the healthcare field, or it's better, in the financial world, or the corporate world, or the philanthropic world, you could name literally any institution or aspect of our existence that has not grown and evolved. Maybe it's not as completely accepted or universal, but there are roots of really wonderful possibilities that have been growing, and now I think will begin to take off in a much more complete and a much more powerful manner. Saturn, however, tells us something different than Jupiter. It's in a car like having the gas pedal, Jupiter, and the brakes. You need that too. We have to find a balance between the two. And Saturn tells us where things are broken, where they're inadequate, where they're not working, where we're running up against the limits of what is possible. So we can look at how could it be better. That's really important this year. It's important all the time, but especially this year. And we can look at where things are inadequate. How are they not serving us? If we looked at our healthcare industry at this current time, or we looked at our government, we looked around the world, if we looked at diplomatic relations, there's no field in which you couldn't say that there are problems or inadequacies or something that we wish were different than it is, something more humane, something less limited. And then Pluto adds a very, very different tone to it. And it's important here, I think, to say that Pluto, rather than being demoted by scientists as it was, I guess, a few years ago, has not gone from our solar system and still serving its purpose there, is the planet of transformation. In astrology, we actually call that the evolutionary necessity of the soul, that there is something that is so profoundly necessary in our own individual evolution that we are here for that purpose. And that is true collectively and universally, of course. So the evolutionary necessity of this moment is more than whether we can envision something better. That's important. It's more than whether our institutions are good, bad, inadequate, better. How could we reform them? This is really about transforming the world that we live in. And yes, that will make things better. And yes, it will actually respond to these limitations and inadequacies and harm that are done sometimes by institutions. But we're talking about something that we have never seen before. And that's what's so important about Pluto. And let me just point out at the moment that Pluto has not been in Aquarius when humanity was conscious of it at all. Not one time, not ever. Because we only discovered Pluto in 1930. And so we don't even have a full cycle of its cosmic purpose in our experience on this planet. It's a 248 to 250 year cycle. And we've only lived now 100 years approximately, a little over 100 years of that cycle. So we've not had Pluto in Aquarius before. And that means that this period of Pluto in Capricorn, again, is pointing out to us that the structures, the institutions, the limitations, these are old. They're decayed, they're ancient, and the hierarchical quality of them or the limits that they are built on are no longer relevant to our evolution and no longer can support our evolution. So this is a time of a true transformation in consciousness that we are experiencing. And it may not look like it today, but it is certainly taking place. In a certain sense, there is nothing we can't actually change in profound, meaningful, and deeply humane and conscious ways. And that's ahead of us. It's a lot of work, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it is quite important to recognize that this is something we haven't experienced before. And if we look at Aquarius as a sign, the signs are archetypes, and we can study them as qualities, inherent qualities, with a myriad of ways they express themselves. And then we individualize how we are going to contribute to that expression or be a living expression. And moving from Capricorn to Aquarius, which we're in the process of doing, as you know, and I'm just so pleased to have more information about how Mother Mary is assisting us, because we need all the assistance we can get in this period of time. We have a lot that we're transforming individually and collectively. Capricorn always sees a limit. It's hierarchical. It's authoritarian in its nature. And you might say, well, the US is not authoritarian until recently. But if you go back to the founders, they set it up that we would have a representative government. And in that time, that was revolutionary in and of itself. But it means that they did not trust, and they're quite specific about this, what they called potential mob rule, meaning that if everybody started voting, my God, what would they do? So there was not a real trust in the individual unless that individual was educated in the ways that they were and owned property and saw the world through the Enlightenment vision, which was actually quite an advance in human thinking. But it left a lot of people out, most people actually, including women. Abigail Adams saying, think about the ladies. Well, that didn't happen until 1920, with much work on the part of the ladies. So I hope Abigail knows that wherever she is at the moment. So as we look at Aquarius, we're looking at something very, very different than authoritarian. This is about an internalization of our own authority. Authority is not going to go away, but for the authority to be external to us as opposed to internal, if we are responsible for ourselves, and I don't mean the pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of focus, because this isn't about the external world at all. It's about knowing that we have our own inner ability to be in touch with, to be open to what is deeply true, what has always been true in our own divine existence, and that our soul is the authority that we are surrendering to and opening to and listening to and being guided by at all times. So it's a deepening authority into an internal, direct, fully awake experience, as opposed to an external that someone else needs to tell us what to do. This does not mean anarchy, by the way. That's not what I'm saying. But it is quite a transformation in how we view authority. And if we all view authority in that manner, which eventually will be true, but we have a lot of work to get there. But if we do that, then it becomes clear that we're going to perceive how we interact with one another very, very differently. So the idea of individuality, which we've been very focused on for the last several hundred years, is an idea that is, again, growing, evolving, and really transforming in our consciousness. For me to be an individual does not mean to be separate from someone else. And we've tended to view it as separate, or tended to view it as, that means I can do what I want. And yeah, I can do what I want. There are consequences for that. They're built in many ways to our biology and to the limits of the earth herself. But the deepening of this concept of individualism, what Jung talked about as individuation, is to recognize that my individuality doesn't derive from my personality or from, I want ice cream. It derives from my consciousness, and that allows me to not be separate from the next person and the next person and the next person, if I actually realize that we're all the human experience, that the human experience is part of the larger humanity. And in that sense of unity, or being all one, then our ability to be individual and contribute individually, live up to our full potential, becomes an interdependence, a cooperative, collaborative experience. And that changes the hierarchy, and it changes a lot of other things, as we know. If we actually see each other as fully human, as fully divine, then we're not going to be able to rely on old patterns of bigotry and greed and all kinds of separation that does harm to other people, and often to ourselves as well. So the fact that we have this recognition right now that something is really wrong, and depending on how you're looking at it, the outer world would say something is really wrong. Our government is inadequate. Our government is failing us. We're living in a pandemic. People are dying. We have a rise of authoritarianism throughout the world in ways we haven't seen in a long, long time, almost 100 years. And you could go on and list many, many, many things. The climate, of course, itself, how we're treating Mother Earth, how we're treating the creatures who are our fellow journeyers on this journey in human experience, our planetary experience. These things you could name and go on from there are obviously all ones that indicate that we need that transformation. We need to transform our awareness. And therefore the individualization is inclusive, is not exclusive, it's inclusive. Aquarius is not ever exclusive because it doesn't see separation. It's always inclusive because there is no separation except what we partly have been taught and what we have been limited by in our own evolution. I think it's important to point out, however, that the development of this individual consciousness that moved us beyond tribal consciousness was actually quite important. There's been a lot of development, a lot of success, a lot of contribution throughout the long period of time we've been individualizing. It's interesting, in astrology, we look at the discovery of planets. I think we're on the verge of one pretty soon in this century, but we look at when we actually can see them collectively. I mean, esoteric astrologers, esotericists have always known what planets exist, but when they come into collective consciousness, we're now responsible for them. We certainly don't make a young child responsible for paying the bills. Eventually they will have to do that, but we're taken care of until we are actually capable of doing something that we now become able to do and therefore responsible to do. And this is also, from Capricorn to Aquarius, a different consciousness about responsibility. What is it that we're really and truly responsible for? We're responsible for a much larger and much less burdensome life that we can live, rather than being by ourselves trying to take care of only our own needs. If we actually are working together collectively, we are less burdened and also ideally and truly more responsible. So if we look at the way that we're living now, the way that we're living is changing dramatically. And there's so many of us now, numbers increasing all the time, that actually do see us individually as part of this greater oneness of humanity, part of this greater oneness of our solar system and our universe. And that's where Aquarius is leading us. And it's leading us into the sixth sense, into a true change in consciousness. Sometimes it certainly appears that enough of that consciousness is active and more integrated now that it is almost as though two different worlds are trying to merge at this particular time. So going back to what I was saying about the discovery of planets, when planets are discovered and we become responsible for them, then the qualities of that archetype begin quite naturally to show up in events, to appear in events. And if we go back to the 1780s, the early 1780s, 1781 to be precise, the planet Uranus was discovered. Now, most people on the planet weren't thinking about that, but what they were thinking about is the Declaration of Independence in the United States in 1776, which was a statement precisely of that individuation, that all men are created equal. Now, have we lived up to that completely? No. Are we trying to? Yes. Have we made progress? We absolutely have. But that concept was the inherent meaning that was possible for them to understand and to carry the vision for at that time, that all men are created equal. So this idea that we were not only created that way, so it is not just that we are that way, we're created that way, that we have unalienable rights that are given to us by our Creator, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which was a revolutionary idea. And it gave the US the power to be that beacon of light in the world, that the move toward democracy and individual responsibility and contribution and possibility became an ideal that has moved throughout the world ever since. Now, we weren't alone in having revolutions and making that change. France followed not long after that in the 1780s. And of course, it has spread through the world, most places since. Now, that was not just about government. It was about government, but if you change government in the way that they did, even though it was flawed, certainly at the time, by their own personal needs and habits and finances and much else, the way they saw the world. The opportunity to live so differently than a feudal society or a tribal society has changed our consciousness for now several hundred years. And it's made possible the individual awakening, the individuation that we're experiencing now, preparing us for the age of Aquarius. And then we discovered Neptune in 1846, and Neptune, which describes or it connects us to the ideal of the divine consciousness, the soulfulness, the compassion, the heart, the spirit, is a recognition that we are actually divine. The founders would have perhaps said yes or no to that, but nonetheless, their focus was very much on the enlightenment and on reason. More to that in a minute, but that was the public focus of what they were talking about. Neptune is quite different, and you had the beginning of the rise of spiritual movements in that period of time. Now, obviously, there have been spiritual movements throughout human history, but the popularization of them, the spread of them, that has continued really since the middle of the 19th century has been extraordinary in human history. To have the kind of information available more and more, and particularly in our lifetimes, more and more and more, that would only have been available in the esoteric school, or to have the Dalai Lama come out of Tibet and spread this knowledge in the world. The fact that we're sitting here tonight having a spiritual conversation about the world and about humanity, an international conversation, I'm assuming, then, this was not even imaginable before the 1850s. I mean, yes, we've had lots of technology that's made that possible, but even the awareness to do this or to want to do this is quite different. And, there's a long list of things that Neptune is really about and has changed, but its essential quality is the recognition of our divinity, that we're not limited to our human consciousness. We're not limited to our bodies. We are souls living eternally through our human experience and many other experiences before and after this. And that attunement, that understanding, the percentage now of people who believe in angels, it's quite high, actually. There's a growing awareness and sensitivity. And that's another thing that Neptune is very, very important in developing in us individually, as it's been doing since the 1850s. I mean, always exceptions, of course, but I'm talking collectively, is developing the sensory equipment to be able to sense the angels, or not just to be told about them and believe it because your priest told you or some spiritual authority told you, but because you can feel it, you can see it at work in your life. That there is a direct experience of that becomes available, and that is ever more sensitized in us. So our sensory equipment in our biology has been changing dramatically in the last 150 years. I mean, it's been growing throughout our human history, but especially heightened in this period of time. And we then discovered Pluto in 1930. And Pluto is the planet of life and death, the Shiva of the destroyer, but through that, the transformation. And we certainly talk about the idea that in order to truly awaken, we have to be able to let go, be willing to let go, to surrender the ego, to stop trying to run our life entirely through ego or personal desire or the rational mind. All of them important, yes, but not the essence of who we are, or our deepest possibility, our most profound capability. And the discovery of Pluto made us directly aware and responsible for the fact that we can live or die. We were always doing that, of course, but the discovery of the atomic bomb, World War II, the increasing dire emergency of climate on the planet. Do we want to live? If we want to live, we have to evolve at a much faster pace, or do we want to die? And that's really a deep question now. We're facing this moment in which choosing to live awake and aware, and listening to the divinity we're now aware of and the guidance that comes through that divinity, through that soul awakening, and through that surrender to the higher will, to our soul will, is what we have been focused on now for the last 90 years since we discovered Pluto. And it means that everything that's been happening is more and more intensified. It's happening faster and faster. And if you really think about the period from the mid 18th century to now, how fast everything has moved with the discovery of these 3 planets in just approximately 250 years. It's been extraordinary. What life looked like in 1770 and what life looks like in 2020. And this is only going to continue to speed up. Danielle was mentioning the timing of the age of Aquarius. And when I started studying astrology decades ago, the argument over the timing of it was quite a discussion, and many, many opinions. I mean, there is no way to determine that unless you agree on when the age of Pisces began. And there's not a lot of agreement on that. So there wasn't much agreement on this. For a long time, my belief about it was based on, or at least my, commitment to, I think this is probably right, was the wonderful, amazing metaphysician and occultist and astrologer, father of humanistic astrologer, Dane Rudger. And he said 2060. And it was based on a lot of work that he had done. So, I was not expecting it until then, though obviously it's been building throughout human history to get us to this moment. However, I think he might have been off just a little, because one of the real and fascinating moments that we're living in addition to everything else that we're talking about here, is the meeting of Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius for the first time in about 600-700 years. And they meet every 20 years. And that's not unusual. In a human life, if you think about it, depending on how long you live, it might be 3 times, maybe 4. And it talks more about, you study Jupiter and Saturn in an individual chart, you're talking more about ages and stages of life and, more practical concerns, the kind of shape of how life is actually unfolding. Or in, the collective sense, you can track the stock market that way, or, governments changing, not revolution, but changes in politics and philosophy and culture and things like that. What's popular? What are people focused on at the particular moment? In fact, if you look at several recent elections that happened with a Jupiter-Saturn coming together, 1980 was one of them. It certainly changed the focus of our politics when Reagan came in to the office of presidency. And then we had another one in 2000. And that certainly with George W. Bush was another change. This election is also a Jupiter-Saturn election. The difference isn't just that we're changing direction from Reaganism and from, the conservatism of George W. Bush to a more potentially liberal, or at least a more expansive politics and commitment to the future, which I think having our first woman president speaks a bit to that too, that we have something, we're experiencing something we've not experienced before. Although Barack Obama was part of that as well. Not quite the same as what this year is going to be. That wasn't an election with this meeting of these 2 planets. And if you think about Jupiter and Saturn, as I mentioned earlier, it's a little bit the gas and the brakes in the car. You need them both. If you're going to go forward, you need Jupiter. We need to grow. We need to expand. We need to have things that we want. We need to try to make it better. How can we create a better life individually, socially, and collectively? But we also need Saturn. We have to do it within the parameters that are possible in that particular moment, to take into account, quote, reality, although reality is transforming. So that's a different subject we're actually talking about. And we'll still need Saturn. We still have to function. That's certainly part of our human three-dimensional experience in bodies. But they've been meeting in earth signs for about 200 years. Go back to the early part of the Industrial Revolution. They began meeting in the earth signs, which are Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn. Not something you need to remember. And the reason why it happens in this way, again, is a little complicated astronomically, so I won't go into that. But what it tells us is what, in many ways, a focus is going to be that's deep-seated and universal. And we've been focused on Earth for the last 200 years approximately. When you think about the Industrial Revolution and the fact that our focus was on what can we make, what can we grow, what can we conquer, what can we control, and how can we use everything? Using is part of that. So we went from a life where most people were farmers to a life where very few people are farmers now. And I think that, myself and probably most of us don't particularly want to go back to plowing the back 40 with a mule for dinner. On the other hand, do we really want to live in a world in which we're blowing the tops off of mountains to get more coal, or using fossil fuels, which are limited but also quite destructive, and the primary cause of climate change, or at least the one that we know about, cause of climate change? Do we want to be ruled by machinery? Is greed really good? I mean, there's so many excesses now in this later stage of these planets meeting, describing how societies are structured and what they believe in, meeting in the earth sign, focused very much on materialism. The amount of consumerism and materialism and definition by, what do you do and how much do you have? How much money do you have? We've reached the extreme of that. Certainly when you look at financial equality around the world, or inequality, which is what it is, we've reached the extremes. How much more can we take from the earth? How much more stuff do people actually need or even use or benefit from? We're going to continue to worship wealth and to actually see people as disposable if they don't have the particular value of money, or of a specific set of abilities, if they're humanity enough to make them valuable. But that's happily coming to an end. Again, it won't end overnight. Wouldn't that be nice? But it won't. So Jupiter and Saturn are going to meet for the first time since 2020 in the sign of Aquarius, but they will not have met in Aquarius for, as I said earlier, over 600 years. And it means we're turning our attention from the material world to the consciousness world. So this is why I said, although we think we're in the information age, what we have is a lot more information and a lot more communication. But it is pretty easy to see in the world that we don't know what to do with the information that we have. We don't even know what's true anymore. We've been told there's fake news and real news and alternative facts, and people live in alternative realities now because we're not seeing the world through the same lens, or even a similar one. In that respect, we have yet to enter the information age, where there is a deepening understanding, not just of having more, which is part of that material, that material order, but what is information even for? What is communication for? What are we actually talking about? Is our conversation conscious? Is it meaningful? Is it respectful of actually interacting with the other person as opposed to talking at them, or trying to marginalize their opinion, or, limit them to what they say or what they believe? And the revolution of it moving into an air sign after so long, and in Earth and other elements too along the way, but particularly these last several hundred years, is that we're going to actually now learn to communicate with one another. What does that actually mean? In order to collaborate, as we will do during the age of Aquarius and choose to do, benefit from doing, we actually have to be able to communicate with one another. I was listening to a pollster recently who was saying that they had tried this new way of talking to people and trying to persuade them to vote. This was a Democratic pollster, to vote for Biden. And he said that they tried this remarkable choice of, rather than a 2 or 3 minute call, who are you voting for? Maybe getting hung up on in many cases, perhaps. What they tried is asking them how they were. How are you? Are you voting? What does this election mean to you? What do you care about? And 15, 20 minutes on the phone, actually listening to people, had the remarkable outcome that they actually had a conversation, and they actually found that people were much more receptive, not everybody, but many people were much more receptive to a discussion and a look at the other side's point of view and why they would support someone or not support them, support this policy or not support it. And they were rather astonished, according to this person, that this really worked and was much more productive. So I think we don't know how to communicate yet, even though we've been developing so many incredibly positive understandings of human communication, compassionate listening, for instance. There's a lot of work that's already been done that we can now begin to build on, and that will become much more valued and much more the way that we start organizing ourselves. So communication is essential to Aquarius, because otherwise there's no collaboration. And the ability to collaborate, as I said earlier, is essential to Aquarius. And we're entering this age during this period, beginning now, I would say the door opening to Aquarius as Jupiter and Saturn move into Aquarius for the first time in over 600 years. But in addition, the reason I think the Aquarian age is starting very, very soon is because Pluto will move into Aquarius in 2023, 2024, kind of peaks in there in 2023, moves backwards, and then comes fully in 2024, which interestingly enough is the next election that we'll have here. And the movement of Pluto into Aquarius, partly, as I said earlier, we have not experienced that before when it was in our collective consciousness. And to have these three planets together within a matter of 4 years of one another, 3 to 4 years, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto in Aquarius, they're not meeting exactly as the current time period this year did, but they're gradually moving together in a short period of time. And the door to Aquarius is definitely opening. Aquarius is also the sign of progressivism. This is not limited to a partisan view of what that means. It means progress. It means that we're going towards something better. It means believing in the future, in that we actually consider the future when we make decisions individually and collectively, rather than the Earth would be more focused on, how does that work for me now? How can I use it? That's, when we're looking forward and saying, how does this decision affect not just me, but generations in the future? How does it affect the whole of humanity? So this is all part of moving into Aquarius. So progressivism, when you're looking at it, is just the quality of, we want to progress and to grow and to become better. In fact, in politics, the Aquarian movement is toward, how can I positively impact society? Is what I'm in favor of going to make the world better, not just me better, or, give me more importance or make me more money or something of that nature, which is much more material in its orientation. And this means that for the first time in human history, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto, so since we just discovered Pluto, will all be in Aquarius within several years of one another. And I would say that is very, very likely to be and to introduce the most progressive era in human history. And to imagine what would that really look like, I think is very exciting. If society really progressed dramatically in a way that would make life better for everyone, can we imagine what that would look like? What would it mean to us? And, how could we contribute to that? And how would that feel? And I think we're looking toward that kind of progression in our human experience in the middle of this decade. Excuse me. Which is very, very exciting. I want to go back for a moment to the founders and to the U.S. chart. It was fascinating to me to discover when I got into astrology in the 1970s that not just people, but nations, corporations, and really anything that is a major event that has a life also has a chart. And the reason that we look at it that way is because there's a moment when things come into being. And if the universe is alive and conscious, then that's a moment in consciousness. And the consciousness of that moment informs whether it's the person born at that moment or a corporation created in that moment or an event that happens in that moment. And you can track this very easily through human history. It's a fascinating subject. It's called in astrology, mundane astrology, after the Latin name, the world astrology. And, it makes it pretty easy, if you're familiar with this, to see how things are moving, how they're going to come out. I had obviously many friends and many people I knew asking me who was going to win this election. Can you tell? Yes. If I have the charts of both candidates, I can tell. Not because I am a magician. It's just that you can see how that chart, that person is either aligned or not aligned with the moment that we're in. And in a talk that I gave here in Oregon in 2012, I said that it looked to me like Donald Trump was going to win. Not my favorite candidate personally, but his chart was clearly more powerful in that moment and aligned with the US chart in that moment in a way that made it clear that there was a purpose and a need for that election to, to put him in the White House. But in this election, 2020, not only are we entering a different era as Jupiter and Saturn move in December of this year into Aquarius, it was clear from Joe Biden's chart that he was in fact the winner of this election. The election day chart itself was extremely contentious. So we are, in a contentious period right now. But I think he will in fact take office. And I was struck by the thought of him, and a few people have referred to this in commentary, but it was Carolyn Mace, I believe, who talked about the fact that when FDR was elected in 1932, that because he was crippled and the nation was crippled, that he had a deep compassion for promise taken in the physical world. The wealthy, kind of brilliant, athletic man that he was, crippled for the rest of his life by polio. And he entered his office in the presidency when the nation was crippled by the Dust Bowl and by the Great Depression and by a great deal of loss specifically, but loss of hope as well, material loss and loss of hope. People jumping out of buildings on Wall Street to their death because they had lost everything in a way they hadn't imagined to be possible. And in this period where the death toll ticks up day by day by day, and we're, really suffering in this pandemic, the trauma and tragedy of Joe Biden's life. He's a Scorpio, and he's had quite many planets actually in Scorpio, which rules life and death, death in particular, though we, of course, all die at some point. But his meeting death in such extraordinary ways in his life, when his wife and baby daughter were killed at such a young age, or he almost died in surgery himself, or the loss of his adult son just a few years ago, that he is someone who is so attuned to mourning and compassion that the mourning and the compassion needed in this country, in the world at this time, is resonant with his spirit. I think that's not the only reason, but I suspect part of the reason why his chart aligned for now, as Trump's chart for a different set of reasons aligned for 2016. And if you look at the US chart, go on for hours about it. I won't do that because it's too complicated a subject, but it is a fascinating one. And, you can certainly see the personality of this country. In fact, you kind of laugh a little bit. We are a Cancer country born on the 4th of July. And Cancer is the archetype of the mother, dear to our hearts all. But in this country, they used to say that the politician who got elected or the person who was going to be popular was going to be somebody who resonated with mom and apple pie. They don't say that anymore, I guess, but they used to say that. And this whole concept of this country feeling like it needs to nurture the world. I mean, the world might think some of the things we do aren't that nurturing, but the ideal here that we could take care of the world. And in many ways, we have after World War II, certainly, in helping to reconstruct Europe, and in other ways as well. That's only half the story, certainly. But that archetype of Cancer is definitely the sensitivity of this country to wanting to be something that would birth a new nation, first of all. Mothers birth us, and that would birth a new world. And I don't know if everyone knows this. I think a lot of people do, but it's not well publicized that 3/4 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were speculative Freemasons, deeply trained in metaphysics and the occult. And they had a vision for this country that actually has a long, long history going back through Francis Bacon and long before that. That this would be the rebirth or the rebirth of the possibility, but the actual birthing of a country that could hold the light of individual freedom, and that we could leave behind the dark ages. We could leave behind feudalism, and we could leave behind kings of divine right. We could be our individual selves. We could all have a possibility. We could all become who we were capable of being. And that was the whole idea of the immigrant history of this country, is to come here because here you could be free to live your own life. You could make it in the United States. You could become somebody here and become the self that you were limited by caste or by birth or class or money elsewhere. And that whole concept of this being the place where that was possible was the ideal and the vision that they had. Now, they understood, however you understand it in the 18th century, but they were brilliant men, that they were birthing something that was not going to be complete for a long period of time. They were birthing the possibility and the belief in it, even though they weren't themselves fully living that belief, since many of them had slaves. But they didn't include women, as we mentioned earlier. However, they did believe in that vision. They did believe in that ideal. They did believe they were birthing something that had profound meaning for the world and for this time in our lives. So if you look at the idea that Pluto, as I said earlier, represents the evolutionary necessity of the soul, the Pluto position in the US chart is in late Capricorn. And we have never had Pluto come back to that degree since, because it's a 248 to 50 year cycle. But we are on the verge now of Pluto coming back to its original position in the US chart. Now, astrologers have paid attention to that for a while. I was giving talks on that 20 years ago because I had my own version of what that means. A return of a planet, sometimes that is happening every month, sometimes every year, depends on the cycle of the planet. It means that one cycle is completing and another one is opening up. This is the planet that moves the most slowly. So this is the biggest set of possibilities. Human beings don't live that long. We don't have Pluto returns in our individual lives, at least not yet, because we don't live to be 250. Corporations can have that. Not many do, but they can. Certainly countries can have that. And we're approaching that for ourselves. So if you take the power of the ideal that this country it was created to become the living embodiment of that possibility, to be that shining city on the hill that called others to this ideal, spread the light, held the lamp of and the torch of freedom. If that was the case, then that ideal, that contract, I mean, this part is my own interpretation. I think the contract is complete. The founders created a vision. The vision has come essentially not to fruition completely, but the idea that democracy could spread across the world, that individual freedom was possible, that people didn't have to live under kings. That has really spread around the world. It's part of human consciousness. And that was what they were here to envision, to create. And as they said at the time, they risked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And that is true. If they had lost that war, they'd have been hanged. So they gave their lives to this. Fortunately, they won and they weren't hanged. But nonetheless, they were willing to risk that because this, they knew, was their destiny and was crucial to the future. Now, in that chart, we have the moon in Aquarius. Moon represents in a chart feelings, but also the feminine. And so for a country, it would represent the women of the country. And I'm sure you've all heard this comment that the Dalai Lama made, 10 years or more ago, that the fate of the world was in the hands of Western women, because we had the feminine consciousness and ability to birth a new world, but also the freedom to do so in Western countries. And the Aquarian moon there, with the ascendancy of the first woman in the White House as vice president, is quite exciting at this moment of this completion of the contract, is that the feminine is taking its place alongside the president, and soon to have, I think, a female president as well. I mean, the door is now really open for that. Not quite in 2016, a little premature, but nonetheless, now we have Kamala Harris coming into the vice presidency in January. So if the contract is complete, what happens next? And this country was created as a republic, not a democracy, though it talks about itself as a democracy, it's not. And there's a famous, story that you've probably heard, that a well-to-do woman who was waiting outside the Constitutional Convention Hall in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention when it was complete, said to Benjamin Franklin when he stepped out, "Sir, what have you given us?" And he said, "Madam, a republic if you can keep it." That, I think, is really the call of this completion of the contract. They gave us the possibility. Now it's up to us, because we're moving into Aquarius, to create an actual democracy, which we've actually never had here. We've been growing towards one, but we haven't actually had one. And democracy is not a Capricorn ideal. Hierarchy is. And a republic is not hierarchical in the sense that a king is, but it is hierarchical in that somebody has to represent you. You don't represent yourself. And even though one person, one vote, that's been a gradual movement from men with property, white men with property, to men, to women, and to young people when they changed the voting age to 18. And now to voting being more and more inclusive, even though that's hard fought too. But my description of this period is that there has to be uprising. By here, I don't mean violence at all, but uprising, which is the voice of the people. And, we've seen this around the country, in many, many ways recently, that the voice of speaking out for racial justice, for instance, or the Women's March the day after Donald Trump's inauguration, the largest march in human history, and that it was to some extent global too. So there's an uprising in consciousness, there's an uprising in expectation that we can all participate, that we all should be heard, that we all have something to contribute, we all have something to say. That coming of democracy, I believe, has to come from us, from we the people, which is the way the Constitution begins, we the people. This is the movement to Aquarius, and this is what, I don't know how detailed the founder's vision of this really was, but it certainly was part of what I'm sure they were able to see would come in the future. They weren't ready for it yet, but the question, I think, for us is, are we ready for it? And I think tonight we'll vote yes on that. Hopefully more and more people will vote yes on that. Want to have that full democratic experience where we really and truly respect and listen to other people's voices. Now, to go back to something that Danielle mentioned earlier, one of the stories that I love to tell, because I just think it's such a beautiful indicator of what was believed at the time of George Washington's becoming president. Of course, we know that after 2 terms, he declined to take another term, although he could easily have had it, and people wanted him to actually stay president for life, to become a king. And he refused to be crowned, refused to serve more than 2 terms, and went home to Mount Vernon, believing that we should be governed by citizens, not by politicians, not by kings. Now, we've sort of lost that. In the presidency, yes, you can't serve more than 2 terms. But as we know, in Congress and in the House and the Senate both, or in governorships, et cetera, a lot of people serve for a very, very long time. And the question about that, that's a policy issue that I'm not trying to determine here, but I think there is a question that's important about, we were meant to have citizen politicians, not permanent political machinations for personal gain or partisan service. And I think we might do well to consider, how would a democracy really be a representation of the people of the country? What would that really look like? We have a lot of things to determine, in this movement toward creating a true democracy. So it was certainly believed by many at the time, George Washington being the father of the country, that he was in some way looking out for us. And many people have reported over the course of these last 200 plus years, almost 240 years, have reported that they had visions of him, or that, he was talking to them in the White House. Many presidents have had that experience, actually. Some of it documented, of really going to that portrait of George Washington when they were truly troubled by decisions that had to be made, and trying to connect with the energy of Washington. And many have thought that they, in fact, did get a response from him. But one of the beautiful stories around the experience of George Washington being a guiding light, a guiding soul for this first contractual period that is ending in the next 2 years, was the George McClellan, who was the commanding general of the Northern forces during the Civil War. The battle for Washington, that's the city of Washington, which would have ended the war with the South winning, and they were going to capture Abraham Lincoln and make him sign a peace treaty and guarantee the secession of the Southern states, was all set to be fought the next morning at dawn. And McClellan had laid down to go to get a few hours of sleep, and they had a table in his tent with a map on it, in which the pins were set for where the various troops were going to be to defend the city of Washington. And if you read the history of the South was famous for having an amazing network of spies. They did that extraordinarily well. And the pins were set in a way that had been based on information that had been given to McClellan and his staff by a Southern spy, though they, of course, didn't know he was a spy. And had that battle gone forward with troops in those positions, they would have lost that battle. Washington would have been captured, and Lincoln would have had to sign whatever they gave him. So this would have been a very different outcome. However, in the morning at dawn, when McClellan's staff came in, he'd moved all the pins in the map. It was a completely different setup. And when he was asked why he did that, what have you done? Why have you done this? He said that he had been visited. He didn't say it was a dream. He said he was visited by George Washington. This, by the way, was published in a Maine newspaper in an article in which he told this story himself. So it's not apocryphal. I mean, one can believe what you want about it. But he said that George Washington awoke him and told him that they would lose the battle and that the United States was to stay a union and would need to be a union to fulfill its mission in the world, the contract that they had given to us. And so he said that George Washington moved the pins to put them in the correct places. And the pins were certainly in a different place. And that was his experience at the time. And they fought that battle with a completely different battle plan than they'd had the night before. And as you know, they won the battle and eventually won the Civil War. And that's, one of those amazing stories that supports the idea, which I believe, that George Washington has had as part of his mission as father of the country, taking that role, taking on that nomenclature to be the father of the country, becoming the first president, creating the pattern that presidents were guided by until quite recently. There's some deviations from it at other times, not quite as dramatically as right now, is that his mission has come to an end. And now it truly is up to us. What do we want the country to be? And I think we want to focus on the divine feminine. So I'm clearly in the right place to be talking about this tonight, because if we're moving into the age of Aquarius, and the moon is in Aquarius in the US chart, and it rules the population generally, but primarily represents the feminine itself, then who is prepared to lead us into that Aquarian age, into that age, that sixth dimension, not fourth dimension, sixth sense, be correct here, but into that sixth sense of intuitive awareness. This is the nature of the feminine, is to be more attuned to the intuitive sense, to the mystical sense, to the nurturing and mothering of birthing a new world. And in fact, one of my great heroes, though there aren't many statues to him, because he upset the people of the time by coming out against capitalism, which created his popularity declining rapidly to virtually nothing, was Tom Paine. And without Thomas Paine and the pamphlet Common Sense, there wouldn't have been a revolution. He became the voice of the revolution. And that pamphlet was read by more people than anything that had ever been published up to that point in time, and for a very, very long time after. I think the Bible, up till just very, very recently, was the only book that had sold more than Common Sense did in terms of percentages of people. But what he said is, we have the opportunity to begin the world anew. And I think we are not only at that moment of being able to begin the world anew, but what he meant by it then, I think, presaged what we can mean by it now. What became possible then has created the foundation for what becomes possible now. And in beginning the world anew, Thomas Paine was an Aquarian, by the way. So he saw the future in many, many ways. And as we move into this Aquarian period, then this beginning the world anew, which is really what Aquarius is actually about, is that in any moment we can awaken. In any moment we can awaken evermore, and that there is no end to that. And that things, we can be better, we can create something better. and we can continue to progress as we do in our own individual and spiritual development, our soul development. But we have been doing that on the planet, and we will continue to do it. We have an opportunity to take a phenomenal leap in our evolutionary history. And it just requires enough of us to be awake and to make the kind of choice that I don't think we're going to be hanged for, thank goodness, but it is a risk in a certain sense. You know, you have to be able to stand up and be clear about what you believe and what you support. And that, I think, is an important quality also of Aquarius, is there's a great strength in Aquarius. There's a strength in the truth. And the truth is not my belief versus yours. The truth is something much deeper than that, which, if we are actually listening deeply at a soul level, that truth comes through us, comes to us. And that's the truth that Aquarius is aware of. And interestingly, although we are leaving the age of Pisces, which is an age more of devotion, and we needed that, most assuredly, but it doesn't carry the same kind of individuality. Aquarius carries both. Aquarius is a rational sign, but it is also a sign of expanded consciousness and awareness. And the current idea that, we can't trust science and we can't trust facts and things of that nature, we're moving into a more rational world, but also a more conscious world, so that we'll get the balance between the left and right brain, just as we're moving toward more balance between the masculine and the feminine, where these can become unified and work together, which allows us then to be able to live together in ways that we haven't fully experienced in our human history. And with that, I think maybe we might want to open to questions, because there are so many other things one could talk about. But I think at this point, maybe it's enough for tonight.
That is so incredible, Julia. I'm just sitting here, and even though I'm not on camera, I'm like nodding my head. I'm like, yeah, that's right. We're chatting over here in the chat. I did have a quick question, sort of a point of clarification for me. You just like seconds ago said that we're leaving the age of Pisces, but not Capricorn. I thought we were.
No, thank you for that. No, okay. In terms of ages, they last for 2,300 years.
Okay.
And the age of Pisces is ending, birthing the age of Aquarius, which is not just a 2,300 year cycle. It is that, but it's actually 12 times that. It's actually about a 26,000 year cycle. But the Jupiter Saturn, Pluto conjunction in Capricorn was more specifically about this moment in time. This much larger arc of human history and human evolution is moving from Pisces to Aquarius. And this is the doorway to Aquarius following Capricorn. Now that might, hopefully that's a little clearer. Because you've got the higher arc, and then you've got the more immediate, and then you have the more personal.
And how long was the more immediate moment of Capricorn?
Well, we're at the end of that 500 year cycle.
500 years. Okay. Okay. Thank you. That was, I couldn't quite get that in my head. Okay. Let me just jump over here real quick and see if there's any questions. We're going to open it up for questions, everybody. So if you have a question for Julia, type it into the chat, please. Okay, no questions. Well, there was a question a little while ago that Anna accidentally hit send on. She was holding it for now, but she hit send on early. So she asked, what did you mean when you said we have a rise in authoritarianism that we haven't seen in 100 years?
I meant that in 1930, when we actually discovered Pluto, which gave us the capacity, as what was the name of that nuclear scientist who said, we now have the power to destroy the world. which we do with nuclear weapons. I was saying that at the beginning of that period, the rise of Nazism and fascism and the rise of these brutal dictators in Russia, you already had that in Japan, that there was a focus on this. As a matter of fact, there's an interesting astrological fact around that. If you look at the four major players in the Second World War, you have Franklin Roosevelt, an Aquarian, and I think a harbinger of the future, in holding the light of democracy at that time. You have Stalin, who was a Scorpio, and you have Hitler, who was a Taurus, and Mussolini, who was a Leo. All four of what we call in astrology the fixed signs. In that when they hold a position, they'll hold it to the death. And you had this battle of wills in that structure that was extraordinary. I mean, that was a battle that there's much one could say about that from the esoteric and astrological point of view. But it was a painful battle, but a necessary one. And it brought in the nuclear age, which we ended up using under Truman at the end of the war. And that moment when Pluto was discovered, it was discovered in the battle against authoritarianism. I think maybe I didn't say that as clearly as I could, but I was saying we had an authoritarian battle taking place at that time. We defeated that, not that there haven't been plenty of autocrats since. We're now at a point where if we can truly birth a real democracy here and globally, because we have the capacity globally now, witnessed in the Women's March, the protests against the Iraq War, many protests, even the uprising around the death of the murder of George Floyd spread around the world. There were marches, across the world, or even the celebration, that was quite stunning that one saw on Saturday, fireworks going off in London, church bells ringing in Paris. That what happens here is a global event. And that there is a whether that's fair or not fair is a different question, but it is a global event. And I think the world is looking for us to put aside authoritarianism here and really return to a progressive democratic vision. And I'm not talking about the Democratic Party. I'm talking about small d democracy. And with progressivism, again, not necessarily a set of policies, but a humane approach to how we structure our lives, our society, and our government. So yes, I'm afraid that was a little unclear, because I was saying we discovered Pluto then when we were battling authoritarianism in this profound way that had the Allies not won that war, we would have quite a different world that we've been living in since. And as we get to this almost to this 100-year mark and to this major shift, you've seen another kind of rise, not to the same degree. Donald Trump is not Hitler, that's certainly true. And Erdogan is not either, or Modi, but they are authoritarian in nature and certainly trying to rule from Capricorn, rule from the old hierarchies and the old structures, even though those structures are ones they're, as they rule from them, destroying. The destruction was necessary because the uprisings we've had since the day after the inauguration, have really been part of this awakening. If if you go back to what Ben Franklin said, it's a republic if you can keep it. Well, if you keep it, you have to be a citizen. You have to show up. You don't have to be partisan. You don't have to do any of that, but you've got to show up and contribute. You've got to vote. And we had a tremendous turnout that we normally don't have here. Yeah. And that was exciting just to see that, 180 million people voted. Yeah. That taking citizenship and contribution to the country much more seriously and feeling more empowered to do so, I think, too.
Yeah. Okay, next question from Barbara. She asks, you highlighted many of the positive, uplifting characteristics of Aquarius. Is there a dark side to that sign that we should guard against, and how might that show up in society?
Oh,
That's
such a
great
good question. Such a good question. Yes, because everything has its shadow.
Sure.
We know that. And, I think the current model that you see in the streets, and I'm not making this comment from a partisan point of view, but much more from an archetypal one. I won't wear a mask. You're taking my freedom. I won't obey a government I didn't vote for, even if more of you did. I won't do it. We've taken this idea that freedom is I do exactly what I want, when I want, how I want, with no consideration for anyone else. That is the shadow of Aquarius, is that it's I, me, mine, as opposed to us. And I think that the deepening of understanding of what individualism actually means, and the ability to engage people in cooperating, in seeing the benefit of that rather than the oppositional aspect to it. You can't tell me what to do. We try to socialize our toddlers when they say, no, you're not the boss of me, you can't tell me what to do. We try to socialize them into wanting to contribute. And, I think we have a lot of that shadow that's already, quite visible in our culture, where, for those of us who've been around a few years, those are just not things that anybody was saying in the past. Not that you didn't have people who were obstructing the government or selfish, or those are all human qualities. But the idea that you just don't, you just get to take the election if you don't like the result. This is a, modern version of something that we haven't seen a lot of in the last, in the last many decades. So I think part of the answer to that is the misinterpretation of what freedom means, which is really selfishness. And that archetype can show up as being very selfish if it isn't awake and aware enough to see the benefit in not being personally selfish. That you're actually much more benefited by living in a world in which everyone is benefited than in one in which you separate yourself. So there's too much separation there. We're moving. Capricorn is about actually believing in separation. Aquarius is about not wanting. The shadow would be not wanting to move beyond the separation. Because the true Aquarian nature is to collaborate and to work together, to recognize the natural interdependence that we do have. So the resistance to that movement would be part of the shadow of Aquarius. The misunderstanding, which can even be dangerous, of what, what it means to be an individual, what it means to have rights, to have freedom, is part of the shadow of it. Another part of the shadow of Aquarius, when you're doing individual charts for people, is they like to be, this is very general, so don't apply it to yourself personally, anybody listening, but generally speaking, there's a tendency often in personalities, is they love ideals. In fact, one of the jokes astrologers make, we make jokes because they're just, part of any language, right? That Aquarians love to have you visit them. Please come and visit me. Now, I'm busy. Could you go in the other room and shut the door? That they like to have company, but they also like to retreat and withdraw. And, there have been a lot of people, I think, saying, okay, if this doesn't go my way, then I'm out. Not doing this anymore. I give up. And Aquarius can retreat if they can be so attached to the ideal. In fact, sometimes, we say about them that Aquarians love humanity. People, they have a hard time with. Because the ideal of humanity is very different than actually having to interact with other human beings who, may not agree with you, or, you may not like what they're doing. They may not like what you're doing. They might actually be vocal about it. So I'd say the shadow is really more those three things, is, don't retreat from the ideal because it isn't perfect. Let's work to make it better. The willingness to hold the ideal as you incrementally make the shift.
Great, thank you. And Anna is saying thank you for answering her question previously. And
Thank
now
you.
Kay is asking, so when exactly will the age of Aquarius begin? So many people have different ideas on when it begins.
Mhm.
Are we already in it or it's coming? Also, what does the next 10 years look like? Peace, question mark?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, certainly when you look at movements of this size, this length of time, although time's of course not quite what we're actually experiencing the way we think we are, but nonetheless, these major cycles, and we are in the transition between many major cycles right now. So if you look at the 2,300 year cycle, you're going to have for sure 200 years on either side of it. Whatever the exact date of the age of Aquarius is, let's put that aside for a moment. You're going to have at least 200 years on either side of it when it's building, and you can see all the signs. It's sort of green shoots coming up, right? And you're going to have, it's going to take, 200 years to integrate that, not fully, but more and more and more, right? Be working on it for the next 2,300 years. So, if you go back to the discovery of Uranus in 1781, the planet that actually in astrology is the ruler or companion, the voice of Aquarius, then, I would say that the prelude to the Aquarian age began then, which was, a little over 200 years ago. And while I can't give you a precise date for the opening of Aquarius, I think the door is opening to it in December of this year when Jupiter and Saturn meet in Aquarius, very near the eclipse. And then when Pluto moves into Aquarius in 2023, by 2024, it's in there for the next, many years. That I think really begins the much, we're envisioning it and working towards it more starting in December. And I think just having, a Black woman in the vice presidency is part of that. It looks different. It's interesting because, of course, she said, as one does, Barack Obama said this too, that having representation matters. When you can see somebody who looks like you, it's possible for you too. If she can do it, I can do it. But if I've never seen anybody who looks like me, whether it's as a woman or, as a Black person or an Asian person or whatever it might happen to be, then it seems almost impossible for that to occur. So the fact that the representation is going to be very different with her in the government, and that one of the things I've noticed this time, which, taking it again out of the partisan context, is that, that many people have said the mistake they made when Obama was elected was to just sit back and expect him to save us. That we have to stay active and dynamic and engaged in the things we care about. Now, maybe those happen the way we want them to, and maybe they don't, but can we stay engaged? Because this is about the people. It's not just about nobody's going to come along and save us. We have to be ourselves the citizens of this, of this democracy, create a real democracy. And that means we can't just write off the 70 million people who voted for Trump either. They're citizens of this country too. How do we begin to create an environment in which there can be some greater understanding and some greater progress that is more inclusive? So we have a huge job in front of us. And, whatever that date is, it's somewhere between the middle of the 2020s and 2060, going back to Dane Rudger's date that he gave in 2060. But this is at a point now, in these next few years, which is why I said I think we're entering the most progressive period of human progress in human history. By the middle of this decade, you really should see things moving quite significantly. And, then we'll be trying to integrate this, figure it out, build a strong platform for it for the next 100 or 200 years beyond our human lives. Yes.
Thank you, Julia. So Lori says, what an amazing perspective on political history, Julia. Thank you. And thank you, Danielle, for hosting. You are so welcome, Lori. Now, this is a question that Pamela has. It's pretty intense, and I'll just put it out there and you can decide if you want to answer it or not. Mm-hmm. Talking about the dark side, tell us about the light that is needed to bring children and women and men who are held hostage in the dark in terms of being used as sex slaves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The history of sexual misconduct in human history is as ancient as human beings, sad to say, but true. We have a lot more documentation on it now than we ever have had. And also, having a degree in clinical psychology and having worked in that field for a long time, the numbers are fairly staggering, to any of us who don't know that it's possible for them to be as difficult and as horrifying as they actually are. And I'm not saying this as in, okay, it's just always been that way. I am not saying it from that perspective. It's something I've worked personally with clients a lot. And I have deep compassion and commitment to that work. So there's no, marginalizing it, that is just part of human history. But one of the things that's really interesting is I was talking about Pluto moving into signs that we've never experienced it in our collective consciousness. Well, Pluto moved into Scorpio in 1984 for a 12 to 13 year period through 95. And I remember sitting in New York at the Penta Hotel after being in an astrology conference, sitting with some presenters, and we were talking. It was 1982, I think, or 1981, something like that. And we were talking about what was coming up with Pluto moving into Scorpio. What's this going to look like? The sign of the dark side, the sign of, sexuality, but also sexual misconduct. What it's going to look like. We don't have an experience of that when we're actually aware of it. And we thought, well, there'll be a sexual disease that'll put an end to the quote sexual revolution, and that certainly happened. AIDS ended that. This, you can't just, it's not from a Victorian perspective, but you've got to be conscious about your use of sex. It could kill you. That's very Pluto in Scorpio. It's a real hand up saying, wait a minute. This energy means something. Wake up and see what it actually means. Don't treat it casually, because it's not casual. And so it definitely put a very serious break on the sexual revolution of the 60s and the 70s. Whatever we think that is, it's a whole other subject. What was there a sexual revolution? I'm not going into that. So as that proceeded, you had in the 80s this focusing in on accepting that sexual abuse in families, it was real. Battered wives were real. That these weren't things that only occasionally happened, or you should just give your husband what he wants, whatever it happened to be. There was a lot of denial for a very, very long time that these things really existed. These personal or societal horrors were true. And we had to come to terms during that period with the reality that sexual slavery, trafficking, abuse. We just had this case of Jeffrey Epstein, for instance, that these are things that are going on, and we have to wake up to the reality of it. And it's a hard one to take in. Who wants to really think about that? Nobody wants to really think about that, but we have to take it seriously. We have to understand that Pluto moving into Scorpio said, you must wake up, humanity, to what sex is, what sexuality is, what it means, and a level of responsibility for it that you have not had before. Sometimes maybe you didn't need it as much, but certainly in a global world, we need it, in a world in which there's a lot of power. There's always been power, but there's a lot of power, and these things can be bought and sold, as Jeffrey Epstein, certainly again demonstrated. So it's a hard question. It's a painful question, but I think we have woken up to it. Mm-hmm. We fixing it, people being willing to move out of denial, that's gradual, and ending it is crucial. And I think that one of the ways that any kind of abuse takes place, whether it's oppression or slavery or trafficking or whatever it might happen to be, you have to be able to other the person, right? That you have to dehumanize that person. Whether it's about race or gender, or, we can use people for sex, whatever it might be. And, as we move into this Aquarian consciousness, I wish I could say this will end overnight. It won't. I'm sorry to say, but we are at a point of being able to transform this where it becomes unacceptable in humanity that people abuse children or abuse anyone in that horrible way. And there's so many other kinds of abuse too. And I think Pluto and Scorpio opened our eyes to how profoundly prolific sexual misconduct and abuse and oppression really is. And there are many things we're having to wake up to: racism, sexual abuse, etc. And as we move into Aquarius, I think we're laying the groundwork for us to be able to stop othering people, stop devaluing people. And it's only from that perspective that we're going to be able to stop this kind of misuse and abuse of other human beings. I mean, I'm happy to see the Me Too movement, to see, people being held accountable that in the past would not have been held accountable. I think that's a positive sign, but I don't know the answer to when particularly that will stop. I just know we're building the foundation for it to stop. And I don't think we can go back to the level of unconsciousness and excuse and hiding that existed before the 80s, though it's not that is gone, because it's not. But at least, when people find out how much of this is true, they are truly shocked. I mean, this is no comparison, God knows, to cigarette smoking. This is something, so horrific. But, cigarette smoking or driving drunk, in a matter of decades, that just stopped being possible to do.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that people don't drive drunk, but you get caught doing that, you get your license and your vehicle taken away from you. You're not allowed to smoke, because we understand that is destructive to other people. We need to take that same awareness into a full commitment that, that you can't treat other people as sex objects, or misuse them sexually. And I think we're going to have to reform, which didn't happen in the 80s. It was a wake-up call, but there's a reform that's a whole other conversation about, what it means to re-envision sexuality. And I think that's critical to our humanity, really.
Yeah. Well said. Thank you, Julia. That was wonderful. Oh, wait. Okay. Oh my gosh, the chat just jumped here. I had a question. Okay, here we go. Elise asks, how would you guide us in this time? You had mentioned the potency of this eclipse season. Can you speak to that, please?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think because of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction so near the eclipse at this point, you'd have to go into a little more detail than I want to go into right now about Sagittarius. But the sign of Sagittarius describes in its archetypal quality purpose and natural law. And going back to something, mentioned earlier, that, putting all religions aside for a moment, and they all have their value and they all have their shadow too. But if you put that aside, there's an inherent morality that we're born with that tells us some pretty profound things. Don't harm other people. Be the best person you can be. Now, we need to be socialized into integrating that when we're young, certainly, but it's in the core of our being. Most people don't go kill other people because they know inherently it's wrong, and most people don't want to hurt other people. And there are lots of reasons why that's not everybody, or not enough, certainly. But the quality of natural law is innate in our humanity. And we had a major movement of planets through Sagittarius in the 1970s and 80s. There's much that can be said about how that impacted us socially and financially, and in terms of religion and belief systems and so on. It's the beauty and the struggle of astrology when you get into these larger, not just personal charts, which I do, but also these larger, time periods and these larger cycles. Is you could go on and on and on. I've got lots of talks on my on my computer of going on and on about these things. The rise of feminism, tracking things over time, and seeing where we are with it, so that because we're experiencing the eclipse that's coming up, the two eclipses that are coming up in December, they presage, I think, and there's, more detail. I got to do a little more study of the degrees to be clear about this, but they really presage, I think, the purposefulness of this next time period, not just in terms of the election and the new administration, that's true too, but the outreach that this will be in the world. I certainly, I think I briefly mentioned that before, but international clients that I talk to, both the support about our election that they voiced and the hope for this country that they voiced, and yet the concern that they also voiced and the impact on them and on the world that they voiced was very meaningful to me. And, if we can go back out in the world and behave differently. Now, Obama, I think, did a good job internationally. He was very well respected. So it's not about one president and another. Some of them have been well respected and worked well, and some not so much. And then some like Trump, or he seems unique, really, but have taken a very, very different attitude. But I think the eclipse signals a re-entry into the world and into the purpose of the country, which is foundational to our ability to go through this Pluto return and know our purpose. I mean, if you stopped people on the street today and said, what is the purpose of this country? What would they say? And, could we define that? I mean, I could certainly talk about the definition, but everyone could too. And we all need to think deeply about the purpose of the country, the purpose of this time period we're living in, our own purpose, and how those things can be ever more aligned.
That's awesome. I just wanted to read Kay, whose question you answered earlier, said, I see, wow, no one has ever been able to answer that the way you do. I so appreciate the historical astrology combo. Thank you. That's great.
When I studied history, I had no interest or knowledge of astrology. I had no idea how well these would combine, but I've loved it. I've loved it.
It does. I before I heard you speak, Julia, I've never really been that interested in astrology, and I've never heard of. I'm sure that you are not completely and totally unique, but no. I've never heard of anyone with such a passion for history and such a passion for astrology, and combining those two things together. I found that just extraordinary and so incredible.
I am not the only one, but there aren't a lot of us.
Yes.
This world astrology is not, the majority of astrologers don't
No,
do that.
It seemed that way. That's why I thought, even though I don't have a big interest in astrology, I thought this woman is very unique in what she does. So, okay, here's the next question from Kaya. Does the rise of unity and good communication have to do with the new belief in consent and the awareness that comes with that?
Yes.
Oh,
great question.
Because
if we're collaborative with one another, we have to first be individualized enough to collaborate, right? We have to be respectful enough of the other to value them. And consent is essential to connection. We both have to say yes to the project, the relationship, even the ideal. Coming to, been some really interesting books written about American political history in the last 100 years about manufactured consent. Now, they weren't talking about the kind of consent that the caller is speaking of, but the idea that, we live in a government which we're supposed to consent to. We're supposed to vote and consent to, we will be governed by this person, whether it's a president or a governor or whatever position it happens to be. And that the idea of consent is part of the whole concept of representational government, and then in a more expanded, more conscious form to real democracy.
Yes. Okay, Charlotte has written quite a few posts here, so I'm trying to piece them together because they're a little bit in a row. So here we go. Okay, so Charlotte says, similar to Hitler, whose soul agreed to be a part of a process of deconstruction, destruction slash deconstruction for the advancement of humanity from a deep, deep level, i.e. going down as the most hated member of humanity. What is your take on Donald Trump filling a similar role, quote, insofar as soul responsibility, in aligning us to compassion, growth, feminine, his chart, we've had enough, etc. He's certainly moving things along in this regard, gratefully so, I will add. What is your insight into his role as a destroyer for the good of all? Whew.
Yes, that's, that is well spoken and a difficult subject. I have certainly over the years, had people, particularly Jewish people, who said, you cannot tell me that his soul is still around. That's got to be in the dustbin. It's very difficult to disconnect some terrible personality, human behavior and crimes and horror from the eternality of the soul. That's a very hard leap for us to make many times. And so it's important not to speak about it unless it is at that larger scale, as this clearly is. Donald Trump is a Gemini. We've had a lot of Gemini presidents. There are certain signs we tend to pick as presidents in the US, partly based on the US chart and its resonance, but partly based on us, because we want people to be communicators. And Geminis tend to be communicators. The problem with Gemini is the old saying, if you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with BS, right? He's a communicator. He never stops talking for the most part. He never stops tweeting, but he's always been a communicator. He's always promoted and marketed himself. And he is a very, very strong Gemini connection in the 10th house, wanting to be prominent, wanting to be in the public, wanting to be somebody, wanting to be seen. He has wanted to say what he wants to say, be believed, be followed, receive those kind of accolades. And, he had a limited amount of that in real estate, though having lived 50 miles from there during that period, he wasn't exactly well liked there. It's just a different subject. But, he then had quite a reputation that got built on The Apprentice, that, this is this story of who I am, this amazing businessman, this incredible success that you can learn so much from. Was that real or not real? That's the question about reality shows, right? But he has wanted to speak and has constantly spoken in the world. So he fulfills that Gemini role. But what is he speaking for is the question. And let me just say that he has a fascinating chart. He has Leo rising. You need to remember this if you're not into astrology, Mars and Regulus in Leo on the ascendant. So what that means is that people who have a strong Leo, they do feel like they're the best. Now, if they can expand that concept from, I'm the best, to so are you and you and you, can we find the best in all of us? Then you have something worthy, right? But the deep desire they have, if they're not whole, if they're not secure, if they're not well integrated, is they've got to be the best. And on a personal level, the ascendant is how I feel about me. If I'm not the best, then something is wrong with me, which is unacceptable. Therefore, it must be wrong with you or the world. This idea, I can't be a loser, I cannot be a loser. That's powerful in his chart. And the fact that Mars is there makes him very combative and very destructive when that is used unconsciously. Regulus there would indicate it's a fixed star connected with the king. These are things that would have been used in, the charts of famous people. If you were the astrologer to the king or the queen or something, you would have put in the fixed stars. They can be quite instructive. I think he has in more than one past life been a king. And I think he does not understand why he can't do what he wants. And you could look at his psychology from this lifetime. Yes, that's a part of it too. But I actually think that he just cannot figure out why he doesn't get to do what he wants. He used to. I don't think he believes in past lives. I would assume not. But I think he's trying to relive something that is gone. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, if you look at the connection there, the resonance between, how long can we keep living things that are actually gone? We can't keep extracting everything from the earth. We've hit the limit long since, actually, at least a few decades ago. We can't keep doing what we're doing the way we're doing it. We're destroying ourselves. And I think he is a living example of somebody who wants to keep doing what he's been doing in this life, and I think in others, though that's my opinion. But he can't. And I think that model resonates with a lot of people. 70 plus million who voted for him this time. They want to keep doing what they're doing. They don't want the past to be over. They don't want it to change. They want to hang on. And I think the destroyer image, yes, he has been a destroyer of norms and of institutions and propriety and many, many, many things. And the destruction there means we have to face the fact that we've got to re-envision this whole way that the government operates. How do we want to be governed? What are the limits? What are the, should norms become laws? That won't fix everything, but we've got to re-envision the whole structure. And because he's kept smashing it, people are forced to say, well, it doesn't work. We need to do something about that. So I think in the sense of fitting this Capricorn ending and beginning of, and it's not by ages, we're moving from Pisces into Aquarius, as you noted, I wasn't clear about before, but moving from this recent period of these Capricorn institutions that are about 500 years old, we're moving into the Aquarian institutions that can then support the Aquarian age. In that movement, he has been a valuable destroyer of things we thought couldn't be destroyed. That norm, nobody would break that. Nobody would do that. Nobody would get away with this. But indeed, he does it and he totally gets away with it. Now he's hit the limit for himself, which you can see in his chart, by the way, but he's hit the limit of how much he can get away with. And that's why he's not going to be president in January, and he's going to have some very serious trouble afterwards. But I think there is the destroyer image, yes, and he is absolutely that. And it has served a purpose, and it's what awoken us to how faulty the system actually is. I mean, certainly the founders did not envision a country of 330 million people or lifetime politicians or Supreme Court judges who lived to be 90 years old. I mean, it's just not something they envisioned. How could they? So he has made it clear that we have to be conscious about not just letting it be, it's okay, it works, and making new decisions consciously and together, with a democracy. So yes, he serves that purpose, but I think there's something else in terms of the resonance of his inability to let go of the past and feel like he could be anybody. How would I be somebody? I think I'm somebody now because I'm powerful and important and I have money and, and so on. I'm on TV and my tweets are read by millions of people. But how could he be someone if you took that away? And that's something we're all even at the most small level or the largest struggling with. How do we move into an age, into a time when we're not who we thought we were or who we may have been in the past? And I think that's an extremely important resonance that we also have with him. We're trying to let go of the past too. And the ego and all of those things. So, thank you, Donald. You have made it very, very visible. The conundrum itself.
Yeah. Good question, Charlotte. Thank you. And Camille says, thanks to you both. And this is a comment from someone who obviously knows something about astrology. So I don't understand this, but I'm sure you will. Okay. Catherine says, So much wisdom, insight, and medicine here. Gratitude from this Libran, Sun rising with Aquarian Mars and North Node with smiley faces.
Smiley
thank
face,
you both
yes.
so much.
Yeah, well, somebody who, you know, with those personal planets in Aquarius and prominently placed from her description, you know, is really ready for this movement. And, you know, Libras are meant to be our peacemakers, you know, to hold the vision of the ideal for us. Aquarius's ideal is global. You know, Libra's ideal is the deep connection to justice, to beauty, to harmony. You know, they are meant to be our peacemakers.
That is so, I know Catherine, and you just got her spot on.
Oh my goodness,
That's
Danielle, astrology might actually be a good language to look at consciousness.
Exactly. Elise says, thank you, Julia. And
Thank you,
then,
Elise.
whoops, we had another jump. She said something else. Now I'm sorry. Oh, I hope she's saying, thank you, Julia. I hope you do a lot more of this. And thank you, Danielle. You're very welcome, Elise. Let's see. Let's find the next question. How about just one more question? Because I know it's getting late for all you East Coast folks, and it's getting late for us too. So let me just see if there's one more question here. Pleasant. Oh, Marie Paul says a very pleasant and rich evening. Thank you so much, Julia and Danielle. Good night and sweet dreams. Kaya asks about the rise of conservationist and oppressive right-wing power in many countries. It seemed as if democracy was going to be short-lived. What's your take on our evolution?
Yeah, the old saying that the darkest hour is just before the dawn, you know, I think has some merit here, because the age of democracy, I would say, hasn't even begun. And this is a backlash to there being enough democracy happening in the last 150 years approximately, that it has really stimulated the shadow of the, you know, power structure that's been around not just for 500 years, but throughout human history. And well, not all of human history, but certainly through the patriarchal period. And the focus and concentration in patriarchy on that hierarchical dominion over everybody and everything else. And so I think we think we've experienced democracy, and thank God we've experienced parts of it, and certainly held the ideal and, you know, improved. So we have, you know, grown toward a more perfect union, but we aren't even there. You know, I mean, I think what's ahead of us is so exciting. It's one of the reasons I definitely want to hang around for a while longer because there's so much to be experienced. And I think Aquarius will usher in, you know, experiences of democracy. Now, you know, backlash is backlash. I'm not saying this is easy or there aren't many fights to be had, you know, as we move forward. But I think I would have to say, having been a 60s activist myself, I did not expect to live to see a Black man as president in the United States. I thought it would take longer. And after 2016, I didn't expect to see a woman, and particularly maybe a Black woman, as the first woman in the White House in those two prime positions. You know, I think yes, Trump was the backlash to Obama. And that, you know, it's not, I don't think we'll go back and forth that way in terms of presidents, no. But I do think we have to be able to stay present, stay conscious, meet that backlash from a very different place than an oppositional one. And I think, you know, we're going to see real democracy in the near future.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. Lots of big thank yous to you, Julia, and thank you for everybody for showing up tonight and giving your attention. I personally, I was telling Julia before we started the live stream that after I heard her speak and hearing how the astrology connects in with, not just current events, but historical events and how that all weaves together. I left her talk feeling just better. I just felt more empowered. I felt more like, yes, okay, there is a plan here, and it's unfolding, and I do have an enormous amount of faith. But sometimes when people are able to put their knowledge and combine it with my faith, it sure feels a lot better. So what I get out of your talks is that, regardless of the country or the people or the particular politics, that each person plays a vital role.
Absolutely.
In bringing about the changes that we as a collective want to see change, because no leader of one country at any period speaks for everyone. We are a collective, but each person plays a vital role. And some people have a more public role. We all play a vital role in how things progress, how we choose to live together as human beings, the choices we make individually and collectively, that no one person is more important than another. And I think for me, that's what I get a lot out of your talks, is that we all have something to contribute.
I fully agree.
Some people are part of dismantling or destroying certain systems. Some people are a part of finding and creating new systems and building them up. And no one thing is better than the other, because both are equally necessary.
Well, I think that's the point. They're both necessary to create what is possible in the future.
Yeah, exactly.
We're on the verge of some major creations, and I really appreciate you offering this opportunity to me, and your warm welcome and the welcome of your community.
Yeah, you are so welcome. And before we go, I want to put in the chat how people can contact you, if that's something you're open to.
Sure. Yes, my Gmail account is my name, Julia, Julia. A is my middle initial. Bondi, B as in boy, Ondi. So
wait, sorry, hold on just a second. I'm putting in okay, now start that again. So say that one more time.
Okay. There are no caps, no punctuation. Julia, Julia. So there's two A's in the middle. It's my middle initial. Bondi, B as in boy, Ondi @gmail.
Great. All right. Great. Julia A. Bondi @gmail.com. So if anyone is interested in finding out more about Julia and either having your chart done or any other talks that she may be giving, those of you that wanted to have more Julia, just shoot her an email, and I'm sure that she will help you navigate all of that. So again, thank you all so much for coming. This is truly interesting, informative evening. Thank you so much, Julia. I've learned so much. This was so informative and interesting. Thank you. Hello, lovely people. I could just make it. Is there going to be a recording? Yes, Christine, it is being recorded right now. So as soon as this is done, it'll process and it'll be the same link to watch the recorded version on our YouTube channel. You were awesome, Julia. Thank you. Big capital letters. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much, Julia. All caps. Thank you, and many blessings to all. Be safe, be well. Do you have a website, Julia?
I do not have a website at the moment, but I am planning on putting out not only this information, but many talks over many years.
Great.
out quite soon. So if people want to know when that's going to happen, they can just send me their information on my Gmail address, and that I'm intending that to start at the beginning of the year.
Fantastic. All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much. And again, big thank you, Julia. I so appreciate you and all that you're doing in the world. Thank you for your service.
And you, Danielle.
Thank you, my dear. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And we will see you here next Monday morning at 10 a.m. Okay. Good night.